do it remotely if we had to. And then when I found out I was going to be, oh, that's right. But when I found out I was going to be here, I thought we can still do it this way, and we'll come in the mornings and do what we're going to do, and then we'll actually break after lunch, and you guys can work on that a little bit, and then we'll come back together at 3. Well, obviously that didn't happen. And so I'm thinking if I go through the calendar, the liturgical calendar this morning, that would be a great break spot. And then I'll go back to the original plan of doing the galley interaction online, and that way James won't miss that kind of stuff. You all okay with that? That'll put me back over to the motel in time to check out and get my bike loaded up, so I don't have to pay for another day. Work? So maybe we can shoot for before 11 even.
Okay.
And James will be happy, James. I'm talking to you. Hope you can hear me okay.
Well, that's what I'm hoping to.
You want me to set it over here?
Yeah, it might. We need to hear you, not me. So.
Can you hear me, James? I have a recording of my 23-year-old son when he was about 15 months, and we were playing with the computer, and he said, "Jack, can you hear me talking to you?" Oh. Okay, here we go. And last night, as I was doing my normal and going through what we had done and deciding how to approach the morning, I didn't work as hard because you asked such wonderful specific questions during the Eucharistic liturgy stuff that I thought, okay, I'm just going to depend on questions to help out with that thing. So we might be out in no time at all, but here we go. Oh, one other thing too. When I was reading those John Donne and George Herbert poems to y'all yesterday, I couldn't remember well enough to do the bittersweet. But this morning I kept playing it in my head, and I think I can remember it. So I thought that this is out of, it probably won't mean anything because it's out of context, but it's a short poem, and it's called Bittersweet. And it goes, "Ah, my dear angry Lord, since thou dost love yet strike, cast down but help afford, sure I will do the like. I will complain yet praise, I will bewail, approve, and all my sour sweet days I will lament and love." It's like a view of the Psalms that put together all of these the paradoxes of a true way of expressing what life is like. So, I don't know how to get a modern worship song to do that. I've thought a lot about it, and it seems like they're always one or the other. I did do a chapel at school one time that I called the Lament Chapel, and the problem that I found, you know how laments are shaped. If you take, for example, Lamentations 3, you have about 21 verses of horrible stuff, like God shoving my face in the gravel, and I mean those are actually pictures that Jeremiah puts in there. And then around verse 22, 23, it's 23 that says, "Great is your faithfulness." So it turns, and yet will I trust you. And so you've got all these verses of lament, and then this little thing at the end that says, "But even so," and all the Psalms are shaped like that. I call it the hockey stick form, or maybe the check mark form. And so I wanted my chapel to be shaped like that. I wanted it to be lament, 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 and then at the end, just turn everything to God's faithfulness. And it was really difficult because every song I could find that was lament shaped had the happy thing at the end of the song. So it was just kind of like a repetition of this all the way through. So I ended up chopping up the songs so that I sort of did medleys at the end of all the faithful parts, and it worked, but it was a lot of hard work to make that happen. Yeah, I don't like to chop up psalms like that because I don't think it's the point, but the songs I didn't mind doing too bad. Okay, so when we finished in a hurry last night at 3 minutes to 5, I mentioned that I had kind of wanted to make it to do an analogy to Prairie Home Companion. Are you familiar at all with Prairie Home Companion, Victor? It's a radio show. It's been on for probably 40 years. It was off for a while, but it's very, very, very American. So a caricature of Americana, and not only that, but like upper Midwestern prairie Americana. But that area is highly Lutheran. Most of the, and there's some Catholic, but he depicts on his show this Lutheran world of Norwegians, of Scandinavians, and a few Catholics. And then he happened to have grown up in a church, like a Plymouth Brethren church, where it met in his living room, and there was 11 family members that were so that's like the whole backstory, the fictional backstory of this show. And but the truth is, he must have grown up Lutheran, because he knows. So it's like, and it's on live on the radio on Saturday nights at 6 o'clock. For 40 years it's been on, and I've listened to it since 1983 or 4. I mean, it's just anyway. I've enjoyed things like the fact that he'll often mention the lectionary readings for tomorrow. On Saturday night on this show, he'll say, so and so went to church last week, while he's making up stories, and they'll include real life things that people all over the globe will actually be experiencing if you're in a liturgical tradition. And it's always Lutheran for him, but like the Beatitudes, and then his goofy story will be weaved in and involved with the Beatitudes, and then you show up for church the next day and the readings of the Beatitudes, and I was always knowledgeable to it ahead of time because I'm planning worship, and I would read ahead the lessons and put the songs around. So it was always meaningful to me, and probably because of that, I started to notice that the actual shape of the show is liturgical. And so if I could maybe, we got so specific last night that we started general, word and sacrament, and then the word divided into gathering and the readings and the sermon, and then the sacrament involved the offering and the Eucharist and the sending. And then we got really detailed and looked at the bulletin. And so if I go general again, in the use of music in that, some of it changes every week, like the communion music and the hymns and the offertory. But the other music is different settings change seasonally for us. Different settings change seasonally, but the text is the same, right? Every time. So that's called service music. It's the stuff that does that. That's so. When I was in grad school, that would be called the proper parts of the Mass, and the changing parts would be called the ordinary part. And I'm sorry, I just did that backwards. The ordinary is the stuff that's always there, and the proper is the part that's proper to the day or proper to the season. And the non-musical bit, that preface that it is right and good to give you thanks, and then a very specific reason that's proper to today. So Prairie Home Companion was set up that way. And there are other things. Since then I've thought of other things that have been popular in culture for great lengths of time. And I'm using that as an example only because it's such a good example. And it struck me when I thought through a few other things that are set up like that, it's the rhythm thing that we talked about earlier. That I believe that people resonate with a rhythm that has the familiar and new, and just enough that happens. This is an aside. I wrote a song probably 5 or 6 years ago by now for Epiphany on the Saturday evening prayer collect, and I mentioned it to you the other day. O God, eternal light, send forth your unending day upon us, who watch for you, that our lips may praise you, our lives may bless you, and our worship will give you glory in Jesus Christ our Lord. And I set that to music, and then I used various and sundry verses about light and day from the Gospels and the Epistles as the verses. And I did it, and it got a good response at church. But hey, I enjoyed that song. That was really nice. And but I didn't do it the whole rest of the year. Next year, Epiphany, I did it again. And then my pastor said, I really like that song. You should do it more often. And so I did it 3 months again, and 6 months later. And I noticed last year, or I guess this year during Epiphany, I did it the first Sunday of Epiphany, and everybody just went crazy. Absolutely 10 people at least after church said, man, I love that song. You wrote that? And it's like, wow, we've been doing that on and off for 6 years. And I really thought, and I did it again like 3 weeks later before Epiphany was over. And sometimes when the readings through this year, I've done it too much. And every time the people have just gone crazy. And talking about that with the pastor, he says, hey, just do it more if they like it so much. And then I started thinking, I think that we hit a critical mass point where the song was just familiar enough that they started, I remember liking this song, but not used up. So I'm kind of like in that sweet spot. And so I'm kind of like expanding that concept so I could actually blow it up and mess it all up by, hear that one again, you know? Mm-hmm. And I know songs in my life that are like that. But it made me think that's the kind of thing that can keep the liturgy fresh, the whole shape of what's for us 75 minutes. If you're in Africa, 4 hours, it's just enough of the familiar and just enough of the, wait, what was that changed? And that kind of thing. And so Prairie Home Companion, it starts off with that, you hear the old piano down the avenue. So his gathering song, processional song, is actually service music. It's the same every single week, but it has a proper part. The second verse of the song is specific to every city that the radio show travels to. So he has the same, the first verse, it's always the same, and then the second verse is like, here I am in Reading, it's 110 degrees, and then everybody like zeroes in on what he's doing, and then he has little bits, his commercials each week, the powder milk biscuit commercial and the ketchup commercial and all of the little fake things. The commercial itself is new, but the brand that he's pretending to advertise has been the same for, it's not been the same for 40 years, but he'll do something for 5 years and then kind of weave it out and put something back in. I think the powder milk has been there for all 40 years. So everybody knows, and we know when it's going to come in the show. And then the offertory part is the intermission that only lasts about 4 minutes. And during the intermission, they play, the band plays. And then immediately after, where the church would give the announcements, he comes out and says and reads notes given by people in the audience, sending out shout outs to their family. And then the second half begins, and there's the whole second kind of liturgy. And his sermon, the news from Lake Wobegon is the sermon. It's just, it blows my mind how, and then they actually give a dismissal. Okay, that's our show for tonight. And then it's not. There's like 8 minutes left. where it would be the sending, where it's actually still a part of the show, but he pretends like it's been dismissal. So it's either the postlude or the blessing or however it is. So it fascinates me how, so even now that he's gone, he's retired, and Chris Thiele has taken over the hosting.
About
Garrison Keillor, yeah. And now Chris Thiele does it, and it's changed, but it's still liturgical because he's inherited that. And he's from San Diego, so he probably didn't grow up Lutheran.
Gaining an appreciation for the style.
For the style, yeah. And actually, the sermon is not a sermon anymore. We were talking about this last night, Pat and Mark and I, that that show, now that Keillor's gone, it's not the news, it's not storytelling. There's actually, he has a different comedian on every week, and it's like 20 minutes that don't fit the whole rest of the show. And I was like, there's so many storytellers out there, and there's 3 public radio shows that I know of and podcasts that are just storytelling. West Virginia has a Liars Festival every year, and they're brilliant. Hundreds of people come to this thing and compete who can tell the biggest lie, or that they have storyteller contests and big fish stories and stuff like that. I wish that they would do something like that on that show. Make it more like a sermon. Ha ha ha. Anyway, so I'm going to kind of close up my talk about the Eucharist liturgy, the Sunday morning liturgy, unless anybody has any more questions about it through the next bit of time, and go to the liturgical calendar. So in the church year, there are 6 seasons, and New Year's Day would be the first Sunday of Advent, which is 4 Sundays before Christmas. So Christmas is a fixed date, December 25. I don't think anybody really knows why. I've heard different people debate why they think it got chosen, but it probably had something to do with usurping a pagan holiday somewhere. So everybody's celebrating this. All the new Christians from this pagan tradition are still having this party. So why don't we do a party and make them come to ours instead of that? And I think that might be true.
It's 4 Sundays.
Yeah, so take back from December 25, 4 Sundays. So it's variable just within 7 days, right? So if Christmas is on Sunday, first Sunday of Advent comes pretty early because you have an entire 7 days. So that's New Year's Day, first Sunday of Advent. Christmas is December 25, and it lasts until January 6. So usually there's 2 Sundays, but not always. Epiphany then is January 6th. The Epiphany. I didn't write down reminders of getting the more specifics as I go, so I'm just trying to remember not to forget to go back and put my specifics into these seasons. Can I jump ahead to Easter and then back up to Epiphany? Because we're dealing with fixed dates and movable dates. And I think everybody's confused about this. Even if they don't care, they know they're confused. So Easter in the Western Church and almost all of Protestantism, all that I know of, is the first Sunday after the first Sunday after the full moon, after the, oh my gosh, I'm going to mess this up. See what I mean? The first Sunday after the full moon closest to the spring equinox. I'm almost positive that's how to say it. First Sunday after the full moon closest to the spring equinox. So if the spring equinox is
And that's
March,
Easter?
yeah,
Okay.
yeah. So yeah, so March 20th is almost always spring equinoxes on March 20th. It's been as late as March 23, but I looked at half a dozen years, and it's March 20th, and it might be really early in the morning, like 1 o'clock on March 20th. It might be almost tomorrow, but it's generally the 20th or the 21st. So, do you see how if the full moon comes the day before the spring equinox, then the Easter will be right now.
Yeah.
That's like March, early March, or I mean, that's the middle of March. If it comes just after that, it's going to shove an entire 28 days or 29 and a half days or whatever it is between full moons, so Easter can come very late. So there's a huge span of time between the earliest date for Easter and the latest date for Easter. And this is, I doubt, an important thing, but I just find it interesting that officially that is a church calendar full moon and equinox, which was set way before we knew all the awesome science stuff that we know now. So every rare occurrence, I can't use the metaphor blue moon because we're talking about the moon and it actually means something, but in the rare occurrence, the church lunar calendar won't match up to the actual science calendar or whatever we call what, and it won't be the same. But it's extremely rare that that's happened, but because they were really accurate, even though it wasn't perfect. The other thing is the Eastern Church doesn't follow that same rule. So though it could be different, usually it's a week later. Easter's so if you look on, even if you have a calendar that's published and you bought it at Barnes and Noble, often it'll have Easter Day printed on the calendar, and then the next Sunday it'll say Orthodox Easter, which is kind of a misnomer. Easter for the Orthodox Church, Eastern Orthodox. Yeah, I call our church Orthodox, yeah, but they're talking about nomenclature. So that's a kind of I think that's an interesting thing. And I read actually recently about why they chose to. Well, some of that has to do with that we would like it to remain associated with Passover, so that we have Pentecost at the same time in association with Passover. So that actually keeps us more in line with the Scripture, and it looks like just ecclesial goofiness that some things move and some things stay. But if you think about it, not wanting to depart too far from the calendar that Jesus was actually following. So just like Passover would have shifted according to to nature's way of counting time, we stay there. So we get to, we don't do quite so well since we fixed to December. It just so happens that Hanukkah falls close by, but sometimes right on our same time as Christmas and sometimes earlier, but we're not concerned with that because it's two very different things. But because the Jewish Passover is extremely related to the reason that we celebrate Easter, we've moved it to keep it there. So I jumped out there to Easter because since it's movable, the dates before are dependent, right? So I'm going to back up now and say 6 Sundays before Easter are Lent, and then a Wednesday. So actually, it has to say it this way: 40 days minus Sundays is a Wednesday, and that's Ash Wednesday. So there's actually about 46 days in Lent, but Sundays don't count. So it's 40 days of Lent, 40 days of fasting. And obviously that's symbolic. So you back up 40 days minus Sundays. You end up on Ash Wednesday, which is marks the end of Epiphany. So now I've come to Epiphany.
The end of Lent is the end of Epiphany. Is what you're saying.
No, the beginning of Lent is the end of Epiphany. So Ash Wednesday is the end
Of Epiphany.
Epiphany then can stretch to 7 or 8 weeks. Besides ordinary time or the season after Pentecost, it's the longest season. Usually. So coming at it forward again, Advent starts 4 Sundays before Christmas. So that's a movable date depending on which day of the week December 25 falls. Christmas lasts until January 6, which is Epiphany. Epiphany stretches until Ash Wednesday, which changes because Easter's movable. Lasts 40 days plus Sundays until Easter Sunday. Oh, not Ash Wednesday. Lent. Ash Wednesday lasts only one day. And then Pentecost, which is 50 days after Easter. And since 50 days from Sunday makes Sunday, it's a Sunday feast day. And the season after Pentecost obviously lasts until Advent, until the 4th Sunday before Easter. And we're back home again. So, would it be fun to go through there and talk about focus? Also, that though the calendar revolves in a year like that, the appointed readings for 5 centuries have been on a 3-year cycle. There, certain feast days, being so specific in their focus, have the same readings every time, but not all of them. So it takes 3 years to get through all of the readings, and there's about 87 psalms included in the lectionary cycle, but all 150 psalms in the daily cycle, which we haven't talked about yet. Any questions so far? Anybody? Okay. So Advent, anticipation, focuses on anticipation, and the downtime between the Testaments is kind of how I like to think it while we're waiting on a Savior. But my biggest focus, and I kind of feel this in my congregation and the pastor too, is the focus on the second coming, the advent of the second coming of Christ, which frankly is one of the things that I think has kind of gone stale in contemporary evangelicalism. I think you remember when I talked about Eustace in the book The Robe, always looking down the road around the corners so he wouldn't be surprised. So you can imagine what kind of readings are during Advent, like the Jesus telling about the 10 bridesmaids and the bridegroom coming in the night, when keeping your wicks trimmed and burning.
Okay. So those are going to be advents of the second coming.
Yeah, I mean it's sort of like this. My takeaway from it is, I always say, Jesus kept his promise. He promised he would come. There's 400 years between the testaments, and I even think about the concept that the Pharisees were like, what are we doing wrong? Like Abraham, like, I was promised a kid. He's not here. What am I doing wrong? And he ends up doing the wrong thing to try to keep God's promise for him. It's like, I bet he wants me to take care of this. And then God says, no, I was going to take care of it for you. And he messes up. He's not disobedient. I think he was like obedient in the wrong way. He didn't trust God, which is ironic because he did trust God and God said, and it was accounted to him as righteousness. But the doing of it, he trusted God to be telling him the truth, but maybe not that he would actually take care of the whole thing. And I kind of feel like the Pharisees did that on steroids. It was like, and then they were also occupied. The Romans were there, and they had a puppet king and a governor that seemed to be unpredictable, and so there's all of these zealots doing crazy things, probably some terrorism going on, and so they just like made up as many millions of rules as they could to try to make sure they were doing the right thing, sort of like Abraham sleeping with Hagar, and then he came and they didn't recognize him. So I kind of see that the Advent in that sense, looking back, he did keep his promise, even though it was a long time. He kept his promise. It's hard for us to think about how long people waited. We just kind of click through the thing. And it's another reason that the church year is important to me, because it teaches me. It's only this much time, but it's different than hearing a story in Sunday school and having no concept of time.
Yeah.
So maybe that is my bottom line of the importance of the church year for me. And I think I mentioned earlier that even before I even knew what a Sunday morning liturgy looked like, I was already operating by this calendar, having found it in the Celtic Book of Daily Prayer, which is basically a devotional book. It's just a published devotional.
Yeah.
And I just found so much comfort and I don't want to use the word discipline in this context, but rhythm. It just gave me a rhythm that brought me comfort. The stretches of time. I am not a patient person. I do abide well, but not happily. And I think that I can look back and see that in my marriage, in my schooling, in my job, in my Christianity. I'm a survivor, but I'm not patient. I try to learn that. And Advent helps me greatly with that. And then I end up each year learning that little lesson more quickly, earlier. And then my rest of my Advent is a second coming focus, because look how long it's been since he said he was going to come back. And I guess he kept his promise the first time. Why would I doubt that he would keep his promise the second time? And it's so, I end up focusing on his faithfulness. I know he's going to do it because he said he would, and he did. He said he would, he will. That's sort of my Advent takeaway. And I'm quirky too. I have an Advent wreath made out of PVC pipe that I put in my yard. It's like 15 feet around, and I light the candles and use tiki torch to the pretend candles, and I mean, I go all out. We used to have a Catholic neighbor that had all these shrines in his yard, and I said, if this guy can put shrines in his yard, I can put an Advent wreath and candles in my front yard. And then obviously Christmas is the Incarnation. Oh, I'm sorry. Can I just mention one other little thing that's sometimes a quirky confusion too? Don't forget that back in the day, you know how we use the term Eve, Christmas Eve? We always meant and on the eve of the such and such, we mean the night before, but we still use the same word evening when we mean the end of the day. It's like this evening I'm going to be in Klamath Falls in a tent. But rightly or historically, that would have been on the eve of tomorrow, I'm going to be in Klamath Falls. So we tend to think of our day starting when the sun comes up and ending when the sun goes down. But historically, and in the Genesis, it was the other way around. So there was evening, there was morning the first day. So, and I don't know this. It's just when I can't try to wrap my head around how weird that seems, I've thought, well, it's because there was darkness when God created. And the first thing that happened was there was light. So light came after darkness, and that's how time's been counted ever since. And it even says in Genesis that that he put the lights in the heavens and the stars for the marking of seasons and the counting of time. It's like God created time. It's an important thing. And we weren't created until there was already time. So it's not even like we're out of place in it. And anyway, I don't mean to preach, but I like that concept of evening and morning. And so we get to rest to start our day. It's a fun rhythm to put ourselves into. The reason I bring it up here is because so you also know that the Jews celebrate Sabbath from Friday night to Saturday night, sundown Friday night to sundown Saturday night. And so Sabbath on Saturday actually includes the day before in our mindset. And that's the way these things were done too. So Christmas Eve, for example, is called Christmas Eve because it's the eve of the day. So Christmas actually starts at sundown on the 24th and goes to sundown on the 25th. So if you count it like that, you end up getting kind of, if you count the 12 days of Christmas, you can feel horribly confused just because you can't figure out 12 hours. And I remember friends opening their Christmas presents on Christmas Eve, and my parents would never let me do that. And they was, it's like heresy. And even my mom's mom, she has a wee brother that's about my age. I have an uncle that's my age. And so he was always getting his presents 12 hours before me, and that was just a horrible thing. But no big deal on Christmas until you get down the road to Epiphany. So does Epiphany start on the evening of January 5th? Does Christmas actually last until it's the 6th, or is it over? Interestingly enough, Shakespeare's got a play called The Twelfth Night, not the 12th day. So it's about the eve of Epiphany, and it would be January 5th. But I've actually read literature commentary that uses January 6th for that day, but it's not what Shakespeare meant. So the eve of it, that language is, I don't know that any of that's important. I just think it's way interesting, and it might be important, something to ponder. Yeah, so Epiphany. So anybody know what Epiphany is? The arrival of the Magi. Actually, it's not really about the season is not about the arrival of the Magi. The Epiphany is the feast of them coming to worship Jesus. But the season is about what happened after. So they have traditionally been considered the first foreign missionaries because they left wherever. I guess in Bethlehem. Doesn't the scripture say that they were still in Bethlehem when the Magi came? There's so yeah.
He's in the manger, in the little town of Bethlehem.
I'm trying to remember because it could have been as much as 2 years, because Herod kills all the children under 2 years old. So when he tried to date when Jesus was born, it could have been as much as he could have been 2 years old when the Magi came. So, but I think they were still hanging out in Bethlehem. They hadn't gone to Nazareth yet. But from wherever, they the Magi left to go back home, telling what they had rejoicing and telling what they had seen. And so they took the news of the birth of the Messiah out of Israel and into their home countries. And so they're considered to be the first foreign missionaries. And so missions, the coming of light, epiphany, eureka, that's kind of what that means. It's the sending out is the focus of the season. So missions and service is what the focus of the liturgical season is. And then Lent is a season of penitence. There's only 2 days that, and I'm going to use an interesting word here, because I guess if you're an old Catholic, it would be this way. The church commands fasting on Ash Wednesday and Good Friday. I think good Catholics fast from meat on Fridays, period. Here's an irony. I never knew a Catholic until I got to college and met British people. But my elementary school didn't serve meat on Fridays in the cafeteria. No idea why until I got older. But we ate fish, which wasn't considered meat, which to me sounds like Pharisee. But I'm not being judgmental. I just find it fascinating. And of course that all died away. But the Catholic Church commanded fasting on Ash Wednesday and Good Friday, which basically the beginning of Lent and the beginning of the, what would be called the Triudium, I think is what we call those 3 days, or Triudium.
Yeah, no, it's interesting you mentioned, because what was it? December. My parents were married on December 3rd, I think it was. It was like 60-some years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And Dad was Catholic, Mom was Methodist, and I can't remember the exact story, but she talked to the priest, because they were going to have the priest do, a Catholic priest that was going to do the service, and it had something to do with Friday. And that's what, and the priest said, well, so it's not going to kill a good Catholic to eat meat on Friday.
So interesting.
And it was the same kind of thing, so I don't know what season it was at that. It was December 3rd was their wedding date, so I don't know what that was. I don't know if it was why, unless it just became something that you just, as a Catholic, you just didn't eat fish, or eat meat on Friday, you ate fish.
Yeah.
To kind of keep you in the season all the time.
Yeah.
Maybe, I don't know, but I just remember sharing that was.
Yeah. Frankly, if it has meaning, I think it's a great practice.
Mm-hmm.
Even if it means eat standing up on Friday. I mean, once again, and my buddy Glenn, I keep talking about him. He and I are really tight, and when we first met, not only you remember, he's the guy that kept telling me, you should come to my. You're it's too reformed for you. Like, I was way too Baptist in his mind to be able to survive this thing, and but at the same time, I was already doing this calendar thing and starting to practice. I had already read Dallas Willard's Divine Conspiracy. I was interested in his Disciplines book, but Glenn absolutely could not stand the word disciplines. I probably shouldn't be using his name because I'm being recorded. He just couldn't deal with it, and he always exaggerated what that meant. And eventually, and I mentioned that our theology seemed to do this over the next few years, and maybe even once we got there. And so he's kind of come around on that kind of stuff. But that word discipline actually is a really scary word. So I try to use the word practice. And even now I use the word liturgy for my roasting coffee and sitting by myself in the morning. I just mean, and because some people hate the word ritual more than liturgy, but I love it because it's not my personality. So if I put myself into it when it's not my personality, guess what? People would call that a discipline. And so, but I'm not a disciplined person, but I don't find it, once I practice, it's not so difficult to put myself into those things. It's easy to get out of them, but it's really, it's just really easy. And so I allow myself, and this is, I don't think of this as spiritual or religious. It's me trying to be a human. That's, I mean, that part, yes, but I let it stretch out into other areas of life, like trying to stay in shape, and you know, that I don't think that has any spiritual relevance, but it might, in the sense that that is also a practice that will help me to also be better at the practice of being focused. So I look for ways in my life to be, like I mentioned the other day, get to notice the taps on my shoulders. You know, if my belly's uncomfortable for a couple of days, that could be a non-spiritual tap that I'm not behaving in what I'm eating, or how much I'm eating, or when I'm eating, those kinds of things. These big bags that are under my eyes right now might be a clue that, so I look for those actually non-spiritual taps on the shoulder too. But that doesn't mean that I don't think the spiritual taps are actually spiritual taps. I'm not saying that I'm just waking up. I really believe that the Holy Spirit does call me back when I start to, not always. Sometimes he lets me get further away than he does, but he calls me back. And I don't mean to make too big a deal of it, because I know that I'm a quirky person, but I'm not an obsessive compulsive person. I'm very opposite of that. It's a hard thing, and I've found this to be quite helpful to me. So the fasting thing, and
I've encouraged people to do it.
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of value in it. You know, that you get those pain. I mean, food's an easy one. You get pain,
yeah, it's a,
and it points you in the right direction, kind of a thing, and it helps keep you. I think you're saying that stuff. It keeps you in tune, and to kind of listening, because you're hearing these things about your stomach is telling you something, and it can help you see and listen and feel those taps in other ways. So.
Yeah, at this point in my life, I have a quirky body. This is to try to make this a very, very not non-pharisaical statement. Sometimes I go 2 or 3 days now without eating, because it'll make me uncomfortable. And I don't know if I've got like weird gut issues going on, but I will be more comfortable. Not always, but sometimes I get to the place that if I just don't eat for today or tomorrow. This has nothing to do with Jesus or anything, but for example, that sandwich we had, since then I've had those handfuls of grapes. That's all I've eaten since that sandwich. It was only a day or two ago, but I just, other people have to go eat, and I don't. So if I want to get a physical reminder from fasting, it takes days. If my wife wants to get that same thing, she can skip a meal. And I believe in my heart of hearts, it's the same thing. So that whole 40 days thing, because Jesus fasted 40 days, I think that, we use it symbolically, but the church has never asked people to fast for 40 days. We ask them to fast here and here, and the Muslims fast, is it 40 days? But it's certainly daylight to dark, right? So they eat after dark. They actually feast after dark. They gather and feast. So that I'm getting ahead of myself with the feasting part, but if I wanted to be that guy, and with my metabolism, I would be the biggest Pharisee in the world. Oh yeah, you skipped lunch? Pfft, let me tell you, it was like I don't see it that way, because my wife, she'll text me at like 6 or 7 o'clock if she thinks I might be getting close to a campsite. Says, "Have you eaten today?" Because she worries about me. But yeah, I would have to worry about her if it's 12:30 and she hasn't had lunch. My oldest son's that way too. Actually, both of my sons are that way. My daughter's a little, she doesn't quite need it so much. But anyway, and all of my other friends, Glenn, for example, he gets low blood sugar and starts to get dizzy if he is half hour late from his So his liturgy is eating at the right times. That discipline, and we have to understand that about each other. So that's one of the reasons that I don't mind the word discipline. It's like, I love the phrase, the health of our souls. And I don't think, and our souls are somehow in this life integrated with our being. Our bodies, I'll say it the other way around. Because is it C.S. Lewis that said, we're not bodies with souls, we're souls with bodies. It's just, so I don't want to be all wacky confusing about but I believe the wholeness of us needs to be, and that's why physical fasting was something that even Jesus did. It's not silliness. The Gnostics are I think probably the reason that we think of these two things as polar opposites. And Paul's language, which I don't think it's what he meant, but his language of the flesh and the spirit. So anyway, fasting, is that really where I veered? Ash Wednesday and Good Friday. Ash Wednesday and Good Friday. And I've known 2 people in my adult life that fasted the 40 days. Neither one of them did the 46 days because they were positive that they wouldn't be able to eat on Sunday and then not be able to eat the rest of the week. So they, both of them, not thinking it through. One of these guys is Baptist and the other one's Anglican. So my pastor, he wouldn't have thought it through, right? He would have started fasting on Ash Wednesday, and I don't even know why he was wise to Ash Wednesday, because he just didn't care about that stuff. He would tell you about that. But he did, and he fasted his 40 days, and it was a week until Easter. He was like, oops, I didn't think about the count different. And then my Anglican friend, same thing. He's just like, I should have waited till the second week of Lent so that I would have broken my fast on. Now, here's kind of where I'm headed up. The fast is on Saturday night, right? And I actually alluded to this. James brought up that service, and I keep talking about it because it's such a big thing. Half the service is Lent, and then it changes at the resurrection, and the rest of the services is Easter. And there's baptisms in the crook of that where it goes, and the asperges where we splash water with branches and all that fun, quirky, weird ceremonial stuff. And then we have a break the fast party after. We usually have a swing band, so there's dancing and everything on Saturday night before Easter. And the lady in my choir, Pamela, Methodist, and she said every single year, she says, I hate that service. I'm not even coming next year. It ruins Easter for me. And I would say, why? Because Easter's Easter. Let's have a sunrise service. And when it's all great, I don't have any problem with the sunrise service and make it, but traditionally, evening is the day, And in fact, I don't know what this means, but part of me has had to struggle through that. And I think about the 3 Marys coming to the tomb on Sunday morning, and Jesus was already gone. So sometime during and the way we date things, sometime after midnight, but the way the way it would have been recorded was sometime after sundown. Jesus was out of there, and anyway, it's all, our observance is symbolic, and I don't know why we hang up on it so much, but it sure is fun to contemplate.
There's no way to tell.
We will, but we don't know how to feast. We tend to be able to fast and overindulge, but we don't know how to feast. And I think a lot of that is, he's not just talking about moderation, he's talking about being about Thanksgiving, and how to partake of something not just being mindful of the grace that it represents, but actually as an act of doing that. So, you could really stretch your imagination and say, when Jesus was serving the Passover meal, and he says, as often as you do this in remembrance of me. And we put it on our little communion tables, and we say it while in the words of institution and all these things. But, what if he meant as often as you eat, do this in remembrance of me? So when you have your bagel in the morning, actually don't just use that moment to be thankful or to remember him, but actually cause yourself to eat a bagel in the morning in order to remember Jesus. And it's like a sacramental orientation that I think is quite helpful. Maybe I would like to become someday the person who's just way over the top. When I'm 75 years old, I would like to be like the rhythmic liturgical version of the old cat lady. It's like, man, you see what he's doing? I don't know. I just find it funny. I'm not going to wear a hair shirt, though, I don't think. Or one of those things that goes around your leg and makes you hurt really bad all the time. I think I already hurt bad enough for that. Okay, any other questions about the calendar? The big calendar. We're almost there, boys and girls. I'm going to just spend a brief moment on the other two things. So I'm going to go way back to the pre-Reformation and still the Catholic tradition. Maybe you even have to be monastical to think of this. But the canonical hours, the divine offices. This is something this actually might be the first thing that ever got me to bend towards a liturgical rhythm. And this is because when I was in grad school, I'm trying to remember what year this might have been. I'm going to guess 1993 or 4. I think about 93 or 4. A friend of mine whom I played in guitar ensemble. So we had a course, we had to take so many ensembles where you would play with at least one other person. Generally, it was actually a class at the beginning of the semester, and we got divvied out into several different ensembles. But my partner ended up being this guy who was a composer. His name was Jim Dixon. He was 10 years older than me. And he had a bachelor's degree in computer science and a master's degree in guitar and a doctorate degree, and he was finishing his doctorate in composition. Well, he was a Methodist minister of music at a tiny little country church, and we were the two guys that could talk about our stuff, and we became very, very fast friends. Had to force ourselves to practice at ensemble because we like to talk so much. He did a retreat with some friends from church at a monastery in Georgia, and for the weekend. Just went off for the weekend and didn't just, like a lot of monasteries will just let guests come and hang out on the pretty property and stuff. But he actually put himself into the monastic rhythm from Friday to Monday morning and observed the times of prayer, all of them. So there was I don't think it was 3 in the morning when they got up, but it was way before sunlight, and then again at dawn. So doing that for 3 days, when he came home, he wrote a short little musical sketch for guitar solo on each of those times of prayer. Except he couldn't come up with 2 of them. He just thought he didn't have any ideas, so he just left them out because he said, I don't want to force it. But we ended up having, make sure I've got 6. He wrote 6 sketches, and he asked me if I would be interested in looking at them, and I did. And they're very simple. It took me a couple of weeks to learn all 6 of them, to pretty much to performance level. And then I started playing them, and I actually did them on a recital. And I had to talk my advisor into letting me do them because he thought they were too simple for the doctoral level. But after I played them, he thought, okay, they're simple to play, but they're beautiful music. And so it was an interesting thing. Then a friend of mine, his wife got cancer. She was crazy about these pieces. And I would do them on concerts, and she would come, "Are you playing Canonical Hours?" I'd say, "Yeah," and she would come and hear them. And she got cancer, and I hadn't played these things for 3 or 4 years, and I resurrected them for her as a reminder to pray for her. And so they're about prayer, they're symbolically representing times of prayer. And I thought, Joe has always been so supportive. I'm going to learn these again for her, and then I'm going to use them to remind myself to pray. So the relearning of them was like I focused my thoughts and prayers while I was doing them on her and her healing, and then I would play them and pray for her and blah blah blah. And she eventually recovered. She beat the cancer, and she's still kicking all these years later, and she still loves these pieces, and some of them are still pretty much in my hands. But that whole ordeal of me liking the concept of him writing music that was about times of prayer, and the character of the pieces are, to me, they match really, really well. And then to actually find a way to not just to offer them as prayer, but to use them as a preface to actual prayer for a specific person. They've just become intensely important to me. But it was something I had never heard of before until he wrote these pieces. So when I performed them, I thought it would be fun to know a little bit of the history about what these things were. And so I started digging in. I wanted to know why they were when they were, why they were called what they were. At the time, there was no such thing as Wikipedia. So it took a lot of research, and I never did find very much. Now, as I look back, I can't figure out why it was so hard for me. But I found scriptures to go with each one, and those scriptures had become very important to me. So they're just still there. So they are. It varies depending on the tradition and what monastic order. But I've taken the ones that are pretty much. I'm just going to give you the ones that are pretty much the ones that everybody in that world observes. So Matins is the earliest one, and this is for me represented by the watches of the night, because it's before sunrise, and I think it's actually usually a quiet prayer time, maybe even private. Like the person would wake up and pray, but not necessarily gather with others and pray. But lauds is a gathering at sunrise. And terce is mid-morning. I think terce actually refers to third hour, right? Would that be 9 o'clock traditionally? At 9 in the morning? It makes sense because nones is the next one. It would be noon. Yeah. And there's prime. I'm actually not. I wasn't going to tell you this, but prime would be 3. Sext would be at 6. And then the next one I actually listed was vespers. And I'm guessing 9 o'clock at night traditionally, every 3 hours. And then Compline is immediately following Vespers. I don't even think that in a place where they would be observing Vespers in Compline, they wouldn't have left the room. It would just, one service goes into the other. And since we're thinking liturgical, that would have been obvious to everybody. If you're at church camp, and we always had Vespers at church camp since I was a wee kid. If we had said, okay, we're also going to do Compline after, and then we were done, it was I thought we were going to do Compline. We did, and that would have never made any sense, but it certainly did to those folks. And interestingly enough, we have Vespers at our church on Sundays, and we actually just do a modified evening prayer liturgy, and then we have evening prayer each day of the week as well, but it's shorter and there's no music. But other churches I know of do a Compline service, and your prayer book has a Compline liturgy in it, but it always seems so not much there to me, and and it is basically just a bed. It's a liturgical lullaby, and there's tons of evening songs like the "O Gracious Light" that I sang for you yesterday is the light is dwindling, and you're thanking God that you've had this day, and there's lots of those in there's actually, how you have the index and the hymnal that has the topical index. Most of the mainline hymnals have one of the topics is evening, other topics is morning. And you're thinking about, well, I guess now for a lot of folks, having hymns for evening doesn't make sense, but it has until very recently. Most people went to church 3 times a week. And we always did when I was a kid, Sunday morning, Sunday night, and Wednesday, and 2 of those services was evening. But anyway, to actually have to commemorate the time that you're actually doing, so all of that seems to be lost in our modern minds, because, for example, where Rick Warren calls the weekend services or the weekend gatherings, there's like 13 or 14 of them. But it's all great. I'm not complaining about it. Just say we don't have the same mindset about being about the time of day. My next door neighbors go to church on Sunday evening at 6. When we first met them, they went to church on Saturday evening at 6. It's exactly the same, and it's the same as the 10 o'clock on Sunday morning. But, there's 5,000 people in their church, and they have room for 400, so they just, all weekend, they just kind of run services, and they're all the same. So the thing that's going on is, I don't mean this but ugly, generic. It's a generic service that's offered around the clock. Yeah. Whereas traditionally, there was a few people who got together lots of times and did things that were specific to the time, to the year, to the time of day, to the week. Yeah. So I know that there's a church in Savannah. It actually might be that Wesley church. You guys know that Wesley was a pastor in Savannah, Georgia, and that's the most recent church that I know of that battled it out with the Episcopal communion over whose property it was. Because do you remember me telling the story about the Episcopal, the church in America after the Revolutionary War went through Scotland to consecrate? So because they broke communion with the Anglican Church by the Declaration of Independence, and so that means the Episcopal Church USA has only existed since the Revolutionary War. Well, that church existed for 60 years before the Revolutionary War, so their legal battle was it didn't belong to the Episcopal Church because it predated. If anybody wants to claim it, it would be the Church of England that would be able to claim that. So some churches there's not very many of those churches. The Pawleys Island Church is one of them. It predates the Revolutionary War, and the Savannah, Georgia Church. I'm pretty sure that's the same church that Wesley was the local pastor. And so some of those churches actually won their battles. You're right, that they didn't own that. It was there before. Other churches didn't. So I think it just depended on who the judges were and everything. Anyway, the point is that church has Compline and not Vespers. Every time, my son used to live in Savannah, and I would walk past that church, and they would have their Compline starting at sundown. Vespers was always the most musical. The monks would sing a lot during their Vesper service, and I think pray more during the Compline and then go to bed.
Now, is the service that the totality of those specific prayer times? Is that what Vespers refers to?
Ask that again.
is Vespers kind of, is it the grouping of the prayer time, the matins, and terce, nons, prime, all those taken together are Vespers, or is each one of those a Vesper prayer?
Yeah, okay, so each one of those times, those are the names of each of the times.
Okay.
So Vespers is the one that happens just before Compline at bedtime.
Oh, okay,
Yeah.
I see. I've got this the 9 o'clock one, 9 p.m.
Yeah,
I see.
generally about 9 p.m.
Okay.
And probably in monasteries, they would have rang bells. It's, you know, and most religious traditions have this kind of thing. You know, remember Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego, and so they would. The bells would ring, and it seems to me that that Nebuchadnezzar was ringing bells for that pagan stuff, and that was the reason that it was noticed that Daniel wasn't paying any attention. And now bells are rung for Muslim. Is it 5 times a day they pray? So it's this moment. So in that way, these times aren't all equal in their content, right? So as I understand it, and I'm obviously not, I never have been able to find much on the traditional way that this has been done, but that matins was hey, it's time to pray, and you would pray. And then others of these, like Vespers and Compline, the community would be gathered. They're still focused prayer times, but like I mentioned, there was some singing in Vespers.
Okay, and they're so this Vespers, I guess, which ones are community related? All of them except the 3 a.m. one? Matins one?
I don't know, actually.
Don't know, they're just kind of, but typically the Vespers and the Compline would be community oriented.
We would gather in the evenings at the end of the day, yeah. Now, at the Reformation, I don't know how the Lutherans and Calvinists did, but the Church of England, the Cranmer and his teammates kind of like consolidated that to morning, noon, and evening prayer. And there's liturgies in the prayer book for morning, noon, and evening prayer.
That's how this was laid out.
Yeah.
Morning, noon,
It's
evening.
very
And that is
helpful.
hard.
I know.
It is hard.
It is. And here's another interesting thing. You know, as we talked about, I talked earlier about if you're trying to read Divine Conspiracy and needing friends. And but the truth is, I felt like I did with at least that Carson essay. Even as the teacher of the class, I still needed my students to help and I'm still processing it. Even when you guys started talking about it, I had new insights that I hadn't had in the 12 years that I've been using this book every other year to teach that class. So all of that's to say, community is horribly important to make things. I don't mean just to make them work more easily, but if you have somebody with whom to do morning, noon, and evening prayer, it's way easier. Now, I like to do morning prayer by myself. It's a part of that thing. But noon prayer, which the actual liturgy is 6 minutes long, it's an orientation thing again. It's not like make sure you have your 30 minutes of quiet time a day, you know, which ends up being a legalistic guilt casting tool. But I mean, that's what our students, they used to have to do it. They would ring a bell. And I think Mark Winger, whom you've met over here, I'm pretty sure when he was in school, our school still had a bell that rang, and you had to do your quiet time in the morning before breakfast. So it was like a gulag. I know people who can't even stand to get on their knees anymore in that kind of a context because it feels like that guilt casting thing from when they were 19 years old. And it's this militaristic thing that a generation, you know, all of their teachers really were that World War II generation of order, you know. Anyway, if we could redeem some of the the value of what they were trying to do and not make it a guilt casting thing. And this has been helpful for me in that. But I've done those with people. Even evening prayer or evensong with a gathering of a small group of people is just wonderful. It's just wonderful. And there are some things that I wanted to say. I will say it because we've got time. But noonday, we used to do it, started off doing it on Fridays at work because when we added athletics to our school programs, we had to change our calendar to fit to make times of the day when there weren't classes so that the athletes could practice. And in the doing of that, we eliminated Friday chapels. Actually, we used to not have chapel on Monday, only Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and we just moved that to Friday. So my friend John Crutchfield and I decided we would do noonday prayer during that chapel slot and see if we could get students to start gathering. So we have what we call the prayer towers by a pond, and I think it gets used a lot now, but 5 years ago, I don't think students used the prayer towers very much. It's, once again, that guilt casting kind of thing. Ooh, the thing that where you're supposed to go and pray. So John and I would go over there at 11 when it was normally would have been chapel time, and we took my admin assistant with us, and then the next thing you know, there was a student sitting at her desk when it was time to go, so she came too. And then we end up with like 8 or 10 or 12 people every Friday at 11 gathering at the prayer towers outside at a picnic day. And interestingly, too, this was in the fall, from the time school started to the end of August. We had, who knows why, but every Friday at 11, all the way into December, it was never raining. It was always a beautiful Friday morning, and we would go over there and be outdoors. I have no idea because that's never happened since. But I think that God created this sunny Friday morning to give us a space of time to create a habit. And the next thing you know, we can't fit everybody around the picnic table. And at a time when they're trying to figure out what kind of rules to impose because the students are skipping chapel, here are people coming on a non-chapel day to a voluntary thing that's happening. That's a prayer time. And John even gave us a sermon. He would always take one of the psalms appointed for the day because I think his dissertation was on the psalm. He's a Hebrew, his doctorate's in Hebrew. And he would like do this wonderful little homily about the psalm, maybe just a thought about it or maybe some background for it. And people would come, and it was a beautiful thing. So it started a wonderful habit, and it built community. It like focused us for the rest of the day, and so we started doing it more often. We couldn't all just get up, and we can't skip chapel, so we didn't have time to do it every day in the same way. But we would do it. Well, to be honest with you, the girls in the office started having noonday prayer at lunch. So they would gather, we would all go to lunch, and they would sneak into our office and have noonday prayer in the office. When we found out about it, it's like, well, you're not going to have noonday prayer without me. So it's an interesting thing. So, and it doesn't become this thing that you have to work really hard at and therefore get proud of. It's just, it becomes something that's helpful. It's like having your bagel in the morning. So anyway, evening prayer is a much bigger deal than noonday in terms of the liturgy and et cetera, but it's still not a big. You can go through a liturgy with a group of people in 20 minutes or so and say the prayers. It depends on how long you pray in the Pope, and yeah, so it can turn into an hour or two, but the liturgy takes about 20 minutes. So there's some quirky little things in those liturgies that I hadn't thought about until I was turned off of that road out there into this Shasta View Drive this morning, and I started thinking, so what am I going to talk about with them? What's important? And in the evening prayer, I'm just talking about in the evening prayer liturgy, there's 2 canticles. I can't remember how many psalms, maybe 3 psalms and 2 canticles. Isn't that awful that I can't remember? because we modify it on Sundays. It's been a while since I've actually looked at the actual prayer book liturgy. But my first evening prayer venture was was already modified because we didn't have all the. We wanted to do a complete musical evensong on Good Friday at church, and we have all the resources musically to do it, so we modified the liturgy. So it was a long time before I ever looked at what actually is supposed to be non-thinking, sit down and go through it. And so you can actually focus on prayer. And so I first did that during Lent 10 years ago. I'm not sure how long ago, for friends at school. Some of my students and some of my colleagues, we met every Sunday night during Lent to end our feast and back to the fast with an evening prayer out on my back porch. And because the prayer book just caused anxiety for me, jumping back and forth and figuring, okay, the songs are over here, what are over here. I actually spent the Sunday afternoon, would open my computer and go through the prayer book and pull everything to a file so that then I could just read through my own file. Created a bulletin for myself, and then I gave it to them and we would go through. And so the point where the two canticles are, almost always apparently around the world, the Song of Mary, the Magnificat, and Song of Simeon, the Nunc Dimittis, I think it's called. Let your servant depart in peace. That's what's used as those two canticles. And I thought, I don't know how now, this is what I was thinking when I was driving. It's like, now I'm going, I get it. But I didn't until this morning. And so I used them one, but there's actually, I think, 19 canticles in the prayer book. And one of them's the Gloria. It's an old school version of the Gloria, and if I chant it, I can probably say it. Glory be to God on high, and on earth peace, goodwill to men. We praise thee, we love thee, we worship thee. And that's it. So it's the Gloria in Excelsis, but it's a very, very old version. That's one of the canticles. The songs of Isaiah, the Song of Miriam. So they're like psalm type scripture passages that aren't in the Psalms. So I think it's 19 of them. And the old liturgy instructions say at those canticle points in evening prayer, you can choose a canticle to put in that place. Sing it or read it. And so since I couldn't figure out why everybody always uses just the Magnificat and the Song of Simeon, each week I would put a different one in there. And I still think that was a whole lot of fun because I wasn't very familiar with there's 3 songs of Isaiah. That was like almost entirely new for me. So, and I thought, it seems like laziness that everybody's just using the 2. It's like they didn't want to reprint the bulletin or, I'm just being silly. Until I started thinking this morning about how evening prayer with just those 2 canticles every Sunday night has shaped me because of their focus. And Mary's giving thanks for the blessing that in her lowly state she's been chosen, but it doesn't focus on that. What it focuses on is on what Jesus is going to do. And Simeon's it's this big. There's like 5 or 6 lines there, and it's the end of waiting. It's like, now I can depart in peace. You promised me that you would let me see your salvation. I've seen your salvation. I'm ready to die. And to me, all of a sudden, and I promise you, I hadn't come to that realization about that text until I was about to drive into the parking lot this morning. Now, I still like to do some other canticles, but I experienced that C.S. Lewis claim, or this thing that just, it sits there and you can't quite figure out why you're doing this thing, and then all of a sudden I had a eureka, and epiphany. Ding! It's about promises kept. Both of those canticles are about promises kept. So I'm going to go to bed after doing my evening prayer thinking about promises kept, and I'm going to wake up to a new mercy day, and it's just, there's so much, it's just so rich. And the only other thing I wanted to say about that, unless you've got questions, is only a reiteration of what I said the other day, and that is the prayer book has a collect for each day, specific to each day of the week, I think. I know it does to most of the days of the week. There may be not a Sunday specific collect, because Sunday has a collect. We can look. And there's also a bunch of collects. There's a whole section in the prayer book with collects for occasions. There's the collect of the day for all of the days of the lectionary cycle for all 3 years. There's I read for you a collect from I think the second day of class. I read the collect for teachers and students. So there's those kinds of things. The collect for musicians that's in there, which I mentioned was prayed for me at that, whatever that installation was about, the canon musician. But that's one of my favorite prayers I've ever heard in my life. It was just magic. Anyway, so it'll, if you're having evening prayer on Wednesday, there's a specific collect for that day. And you may think, well, I can pray any prayer. Sure you can, but they've chosen one that has a symbolic meaning for Wednesday. And certainly the Friday and Saturday are that way. And I already mentioned those to you. Friday is Good Friday, always. Saturday is the waiting for the resurrection, always. And so you get, O Lord Jesus Christ, by your death, you have taken away the sting of death. Grant that we may follow you in faith where you have led the way, and fall asleep in you and wake up like you. That's just beautiful. It's just beautiful. And then Saturday, the O God, eternal light, send forth your unending day. The resurrection, the unending day. Paul talks about the eternal Sabbath. And that's something that I've note to self. Study Paul's concept of the eternal Sabbath. I know there's got to be theological tomes written on that the seventh day of creation is this thing that is eternally meant to go on. Not necessarily that no creation has happened, because I went to a lava tube last night. And apparently that wasn't created before the seventh day of creation, and that is a magnificent thought for me. But anyway, the theological concept of the eternal Sabbath, the eternal rest, is a beautiful thought for me, and I think that's what that's getting at. That eternal light, send forth your unending day. There is no night. I mean, John talks about heaven in that way, and anyway, I got to shut up. I'm just going on and on and on. Do you have any questions? Either
Subway Cave. You went to Subway Cave?
Yeah, that was just magnificent. There's a cave back home that when I was a wee child, I've always been obsessed with maps. And so back in the day, no cell phones or anything, everybody took a map when you went. We went camping in the mountains, and you'd have a map, and there's these tiny little roads, and my dad would be driving, I would be sitting back there staring at the map, and we go through a town, and I would look and see. So I've always loved them, and he still makes fun of me because I'm still the same way. I have an atlas on my motorcycle, and that's what I use. And there was a cave there, or there was this thing on the map said Sinks of Gandhi, and I ever asked. I was 10 years old and knew what that was, but then it wasn't there anymore. And about 10 or 15 years ago, I was camping on this river, and Allison's uncle asked me, have you ever been to the Sinks of Gandhi? And I said, no, but I used to see that on the map. No, you didn't. It's on private property. They've never had that on a map. And I know they had it on a map. So I actually dug through some boxes from my parents, and it sure was there. But somehow the property owner changed, and they asked the state to take it off the maps. And anyway, last spring, Glenn and I went up there and found it. Which is easier now because People have sneaked in there and marked coordinates, and word gets out. So we went and found it and tried to walk through it. It's about 1.3 miles through, and the river flows all the way through. It comes out, goes in one side of the mountain, flows all the way through the mountain, comes out the other side. And we started at the downstream side, tried to make it all the way up to the upside. We got about an hour and a half in. I mean, you can imagine that that was a third of a mile of the subway cave, but then put all of these boulders, some of them 2 stories high, right in the blackest, darkest thing you can imagine, with 4 foot of rushing water. It was quite an experience, and but we didn't make it through. We couldn't find the out because we got to a spot where it should have been within 50 feet or so, and the water was this far from the ceiling, and I could not make myself a mile in the mountain, close my eyes, and take my hope my flashlight didn't drown, because there was no way to get my head through there, and my feet couldn't touch at that point.
Yep.
So we turned around and went back. Another hour and 45 minutes back out of there. I'll probably never ever have the guts to do that ever again, but it was one of those spontaneous, hey, it was started drizzling rain. We couldn't fish anymore. I said, let's go find this cave. And we looked for a couple hours until we found it. And then come to find out that that's the worst time you could possibly do that in the mountains, because even if it's not raining hard here, it could be raining hard over there, and the next thing you know, you got 10 feet of water coming through that cave, smashing you up and drowning. Crazy stuff, but I've seen that happen, but it didn't occur to me that it would happen in a cave. Subway cave, it was awesome.
Well, I should have known that, because for West Virginia, it's splunkers. You guys just love to go.
We love to go. We're dwarves,
yeah,
right?
Yeah.
Under the earth. Mm-hmm. We love to fish and go under the earth.
Yeah.
All right. So guess what? I don't think I've got anything to add to that stuff. So I think if you're done, I'm going to give you the idea that I have, and that you can listen to this, but you don't have to do any. You're actually welcome to join us if you want. We online, we've been blogging, reading this book, and talking about it together a little bit online. These guys have responded to the chapter, put up a blurb, and then the other guy responds to his in addition to his own. And we've done it with, I think, 5, all 4 of those essays plus an essay by Timothy Keller and a response by Lee Irons. So there's 5 of them? I think that's right. Okay, so when I expected that it was all changed and I wasn't going to be out here, I took what I had meant to do in this book and began creating an outline of, because I just think it's such a wonderfully easy read and still tasty. I don't know if I would say meaty. It might be, actually, but it's certainly tasty. It's savory to me. So what if we were to go through, what if I tossed all of this liturgy stuff at y'all, and you're like, okay, So, well, can we at least discuss if the things that we claim it accomplishes are actually important things? So we've spent the entire first day and quite a bit of the second day, even here, talking about what it is that we're trying to do. Why are we gathering? And certainly these guys in these essays did that. And then I sat here on the third day, making an apologetic for laying all of this foundation so that if we come up with anything, at least it'll have someplace to stick. So you got to have something that we're after before anything makes any difference to if it's actually going to be able to be accomplished. And not all, we've seemed to have done pretty well, but in my undergrad classes, there's no way we're going to get to the end of the semester and everybody think that we're getting together to do the same thing, or much less how that looks or what accomplishes it. So yeah, we might be able to say the worship of God and the edification of the saints, but then the details come up, and therein is the devil, I guess you would say. So we seem to have done pretty well with putting something out there that we can agree. So if we look through, when I looked through Galley's book, I thought, okay, his whole book presentation is that the liturgy is awesome because of this. This is what it comes like. So I could say, oh, well, there you go. Or I could say, but I don't think that is important. So therefore the liturgy not. So I thought that a way for no matter how you guys responded, we could engage it in the way that's meaningful to each person, right? And so I just figured, and this is simple, it sounds like it's complicated, it's a simple thing that I think is going to work. And that is, when I began to outline his claims, like this is accomplished. So I can say, is that something that we think ought to be accomplished? No. And then we can say, well then, blah, blah, blah. But what ought to be then instead? And what might we do to accomplish it? So even if we, if somebody says, no, I'm a Plymouth Brethren, and there's no way I'm ever going to be a liturgy, well then you can go back to your church with the mindset that you're being more intentional and procedural to get to that intention. If it is a good idea, and you agree that does accomplish it, then we've got a new tool. Or it is a good idea, but I don't like that tool. What tool might you use to accomplish that same goal? So that's kind of what. So I guess all of a sudden we're shifting for the sake of worship planning, we're shifting to a sort of an educational mindset. I don't know if that's the right word to use, but that's my background in college was a music education major, and it was always objectives and procedures and objectives and procedures. And it's why I'm so judgmental about that kind of stuff now, I think. So surprisingly, there's a bunch of them. So if it's okay with you guys, or you, and James, hey James, I'll start posting little by little. I'm not just going to throw it out there. So I'll say first chapter, and you said August 18th.
I think August 18th is the end of the semester.
You're right. So I want you to do a project that I'll put the rubric to. Actually, I might go ahead and do that first, if I in the next few days, if I can actually have internet. I would like to give you a simple rubric for a worship planning project for a special day, so it won't be just a normal Sunday morning. And you can cull ideas and liturgies and mix and match. And I want some prose, so that'll be sort of like the final closure bit for you. And I'll put it up so that you can kind of work on it as you want. And the way it is, that's like almost 7 weeks away, so you have plenty of time. Meanwhile, I think I'll pace the galley. I think there's 14 chapters, and it won't actually be important to me if we make it to the end. So I'll put up my outline questions for chapter 1, and if you guys bite, I'll put up chapter 2. If you're like procrastinators, I'll wait a little bit until it starts getting scary. You know what I'm saying? So I'll try to let you and James pace how quickly those things come, and if it looks like, well, I'm not going to get as much as I wanted to, I'll like rush you. Is that fair? Is that too postmodern?
No, that's so you're envisioning posting something about chapter 1 and then we'll
asking you to respond
in the blog format, but not in some kind of time frame like we had been doing.
Right.
Just respond to it and we'll go back and forth, kick it around.
Yeah, unless you just say, I'm not going to do it for 6 weeks, and then it's like we won't get done, and then I'll say, no, deadline. I'll make up a deadline.
Okay.
Yeah.
But through the 14 chapters or whatever it is, it's fun. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I can give you an idea of what to expect. I have here in my outline chapter 1, and I named it myself. I mean, he has a title, but I named it Shape of the Liturgy. So we've spent a lot of time yesterday and today talking about that very thing, shape of liturgy. And then I just put under here, these are Galley's claims in my estimation about it. It's the weekly rehearsal of the story of salvation. Participation helps us to understand ourselves as a part of history. I think James is the one that brought that up a couple of days ago. He liked that idea. The fact that it isn't culturally relevant helps us understand what parts of culture aren't relevant to the story of salvation. So these are claims that I gathered from, and some of these may not even be things that he actually said, but this is kind of what I thought he was saying. But some of them are things that he just actually said. So it just occurred to me, if I could give you mine, and you can interact in a number of ways. You can say, I don't see how it's the weekly rehearsal, or you can say that's not important to do, or you can say, oh yeah, it does, it's a great idea. But you might also find other things in there that I missed. We're sort of going to do the same thing, but I want to be a little more specific in the way that we're interacting with the chapters. And I think that that'll be easy to do because the chapters are so much simpler than the ones we've been reading. His chapter 2 is the liturgical calendar, the thing that we just most recently did. And 3 is community. So we've discussed everything in there. We just haven't done it quite as plainly and easy to understand as he does. That's why that book is so good. Chapter 4 is like our ability or the invitation for us to get together with a holy, ineffable God, which the liturgy allows us to figure out how to try. It's just, yeah. Instead of the sort of the modern concept is like, let's name him, define him, and then have a relationship with him or an experience with like this. Like, even if that's possible, this helps us to understand what a crazy grace-filled notion that is. So anyway, and again, there's just so many ways that you guys can respond to that, and I'll try to be my normal over-wordy self when I start you off on it, so that it can be as clear as possible what I'm talking about. Any questions about that? All right, Victor, if you would like to participate, you don't even have to say now whether you want to. Just say, send me a note, and I can send you an invitation to that blog, so you can join up and read what we're doing, even if you just want to eavesdrop.
Yeah, I just want to say that it looks like it was the reason why I ended up being here this week.
Good.
It looks like this is my very last day on intensives, so I'll probably be leaving to Ecuador quite shortly, actually.
Really?
So I just want to thank you for.
Thanks for joining us.
This time, but more than anything, I would like to. I need to talk with Dr. Boyd and touch base with him a couple of things, but I'm very interested in developing a liturgy for the arts, but I don't want it to make what we've been talking, right? A church for the hipsters, a church for the millennials, a church for
But like for a discipline.
Yeah. I want to get rid of that limitations and hopefully try to be friends with the idea that the artists don't go to church. That says something.
Mm-hmm.
So how then can I implement liturgy that is faithful to the tradition, but is quote unquote friendly to my crew.
Yeah, there's the church, the modern church. No, I can't use that word. I keep trying to stop using the word contemporary because we now have pictures of people. when I say that word, I think we picture people, specific human beings, and I try to avoid that. But modern actually means modern now. It doesn't mean the thing that's happened. It doesn't mean the same thing as contemporary anymore. So because otherwise we wouldn't have to have a postmodern. It makes me wonder if we'll have a post-contemporary, at least in the Christian world. If we need a postmodern word in the culture, maybe we need a post-contemporary. We actually have the term post-Christian. It's used all the time. So I wrote a wonderful blog. I really believe it's wonderful, called the Post Blog, and about post-toasties and post-Christian and postmodern and everything. Post-haste. Yeah, I was being really snarky, but so when I say modern, actually just now I should have said contemporary, because I don't mean the modern as in because that would be Reformation, right? The Renaissance. But I'm talking about in terms of culture. I'm talking about what's going on right now. Not interested in the artist. So they got no right to wonder why artists aren't interested in them, right? Just no right. And the more Calvinistic, it's not just it's not just that they're not interested. It's that there's or more Zwinglian, that it's like an actual no. It's like that's some dangerous stuff right there. I mean, think about Savonarola that we were talking about the other day, who's like burning all those paintings, and who knows how many things would have been auctioned off now for $30 million that he burned up out in the front of the Medici Bank. Just fascinating stuff. On the other hand, I almost mentioned him yesterday about I would have loved to hear him preach. He brought up Jonathan Edwards, and I was like, I would have loved to hear what was going on, what was coming out of his mouth. So it's not just that they're not interested. Sometimes it's an actual animosity towards art, vanity, right? Or the concept of where are the lines that they had this problem in Italy, even in the 60s. We look at a naked sculpture and we just think they didn't have the hang-ups, but they did. That was shocking sometimes to them too. And when the Borgia popes had some of those sculptures in the Vatican, it was like scandalous across Europe for a while. So we're not the only people with hang-ups, and it's not that the hang-ups are sometimes bad, but when you toss out all art with all art, you end up alienating an entire culture and a wiring that God put into people. And so there are groups of people that instead of when you find it nearly impossible to find a place where you can be nurtured, and you could say that because of Florence and Rome, the church henceforth did nurture art until the Reformation. And then and so people have this mindset that artists back in the day could make a living doing art. Now they can't, and it's just not fair. And they're like, that's not true. Artists could never make a living. There's never been a day in history where artists could make a living doing art. In fact, even musicians, right? So that's actually something that's more fair now, because people can make a living. Even not famous people can make a living. Look at me. So, but it's always been patronage of governments, culture, and church. That has always been what has propagated it. So we're really in a place where everything but music suffers, and storytelling suffers because the church is not interested in it. We're still that modern age of reason, oratory, blah, blah, blah. So there are places that instead of trying to get that stuff to happen, create communities. And it started in France with Francis Schaeffer, right? Well, started, but he had a very important one. In France now, there's the Taizé community that's very artistic. But there's a church, I can't remember the name of it. Johnny Baker is the pastor in England, and he put out a book called He has a blog, if it's still there, called Johnny Baker Blog, and I think it's JONNY. But he's got a book called Alt.Worship. So obviously it's dated. It's probably 2003 or 4, and being so contemporary, it'll have been dated now. But I've read, having gotten it, it's got tons of liturgies in it, but they're all extremely quirky and contemporary. And because he grew up Anglican probably at Holy Trinity Brompton, the same as my buddies. And he's just like zeroed in. His confessions are sometimes so specific as to like Big Macs and, confessing things that are. The prayer book uses the term general confession. That's not what he's interested in. He's interested in people realizing their specificity. Yeah. So he's got a lot of those kinds of things. He's got a lot of seasonal thing. I've done a lot of readings that he and his team, it's not just him, otherwise, he's got a team of artistic people around him. And then there are things you can't see in the book because he's got photographers and painters and filmmakers that are doing video for services, and he's a very, very now kind of guy. When you read this book, you'll say, it's outdated, it's 15 years old. But he's not. It's just that as soon as it goes into print, it starts to devalue. So he's still doing his thing. And Johnny Baker, I just for some reason can't remember the name of his church, but I've actually read.
Is he in the UK?
Yeah, he's in London, I'm pretty sure. And there's some other guys here. There's a guy in Minneapolis named. Anyway, yeah, he's got a church called Solomon's Porch, and there's a church in Houston called Ecclesia with Chris C. But these guys are very, very artistically minded, and if you can find what they're writing about, you can get some ideas. Is what I'm saying. I've read blogs from some of Johnny's team members. There's a girl named Lizzie Everhard that goes to his church, and she's a professional photographer. And I've looked at photography projects she's done that turned into installations that were. She actually inspired me to do a 12 Days of Christmas photo journal, and that it's had a pretty big impact. We also did an art installation at my church as a Good Friday service on the Stations of the Cross. So for 6 months before Lent, we invited people to submit art projects on a specific Station of the Cross, and then we set up an installation where people could come, and we left it open all weekend, and hundreds of people came, and they would work their way through the Stations of the Cross on Good Friday with an art exhibit. Then there was sculpture, assemblage, painting, photography, you name it. What would you call it? Sewing. What's that called? Sewing. Quilting. Yeah, I mean, I don't even know what to call it because it was so creative. It was just so creative. Yeah. So that's cool stuff.
The reason why I brought that up is because I know there is kind of like an idea of welcoming this, but the risk is welcoming sometimes nonsense of this.
Yeah.
And you know what I mean. But I think that we're lacking as aspiring ministers, it is consistency in the relevance of the meaning of it.
Yeah.
So I think a proposal have not been accepted because it have not been developed properly. Because what you just said is time taking. It took you like 20 years to figure out some of these things.
Oh yeah.
And it is what and I finish with this. And it is what we don't like sometimes to take advantage of, it is discipline. And I saw much I'm so much fascinated when I hear somebody saying, wait a minute, God put us in a rhythm. Because I've been wrestling with this. You know, like, if God put in a rhythm the whole universe, how can we not have a rhythm? You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So,
Look, think in our rising up and our laying down and our going out and our coming in. It's so rhythmic. The
But-
scripture itself is rhythmic.
that, to me, spiritually speaking, that's counterculture. Because the culture sells the lie that do not follow any rhythms in life.
That's right.
You know, whatever
follow your own
fast
rhythm.
food or whatever, you know, fast drink or whatever is like get out of your routine. That's the message we hear all over from
Yeah.
musicians,
Right.
from entertainment, from anything.
Right.
It's lacking a routine. But critically speaking, that's completely the opposite of our Christian faith.
Yeah.
So we're able to embrace and speak in those terms, speak with some things that the culture will understand like this. Then we're overcoming, or we're entering the field that is ours. You know, spiritually speaking, because we were made for routines, and that's a shifting.
I think we have a strange idea. I think that sometimes we make up ways to think that we're being challenged or challenging that are exactly the opposite of the thing. So culturally, we do this. And I was thinking about the concept of giving up your life for Jesus. Like, if I say that in the general population, even Christians, you think that I mean becoming a martyr instead of surrendering your life. I believe that in this, now this may not be true. How can I know myself this well? But I think that it would be much easier for me to die for Jesus, to make a decision. If ISIS is, I don't think it would be easy, but I think it's a lot easier than living the way he's asking me to live day after day after day after day. And so we have this notion of what it means. So you use the word countercultural, or breaking rhythms, do whatever you want when you're like, we make up these things like, I'm an extreme such and such. I read about this guy that just did El Capitan unaided recently. It's like, so you could say that people aren't supposed to climb that rock, and therefore he somehow subverted nature, or you can say there were places for him to put his fingers and toes at every place that he needed to put his fingers and toes to get from here to there. Therefore, he submitted to what was there. So if he had gone up by a rock, this is just philosophical. I don't mean this to be spiritual or right. If he had gone up with ropes and help, then he's subverting nature, because he's using agency to get, I know this is nuts, but he's using our inventions and tools to do what the rock ought not to allow. But this guy actually did what the rock does allow, which means he didn't go against the grain. Ropes and tools and picks, and that's against the grain. Finding the way in what he's been given, that's a discipline that's not against the grain. Now that's extreme. It is extreme, but he did it with what was there. So if you think about all the other things that maybe seem less extreme, at least they're more common, like skiing. It's like, that's an extreme sport, but guess what? You're using gravity. You're submitting yourself and taking what comes, right? It's like you learn how to do. So maybe it's just our human need to come to the place that we can actually do a thing that we ought to be able to do, and then calling it extreme. You know, learning to face each day and say, I'm going to take it on. But in fact, we're giving ourselves to what's, I think that's what pilgrimages are about. And you don't go out there and, I mean, you put yourself where you have to face what's coming and deal with it. That's the purpose of a pilgrimage or a sojourn or whatever. Sometimes we do those for fun, but not usually. Certainly most people who ski for fun, but I believe it's the same kind of thing. And all of those things, whether they're disciplines or entertainments, they can teach us the same kinds of things. Whitewater rafting, you don't paddle upstream. That would be against the grain, literally against the grain. You get in and you go downstream. So I just think it's those kinds of things might be something that we can teach that's countercultural. It's like there is the rhythms of life, just like learn to submit to those.
Yeah.
Go to bed when it's time to go to bed. Get up when it's time to get up. Get what you got to get done during that time. I mean, don't answer the phone when you ought not to be answering the phone. I mean, I don't know how to say, but it's like we really have been given by God a healthy rhythm and a healthy way that things are. And there are things that we do that are against the grain that are also healthy. We blast off rockets from the earth and explore. I think that's cool stuff. But most of us pretend to be going against the grain when we're actually learning to operate in ways that we have no control. All I can do, if you put me at the top of the hill on a pair of skis and shove me, then I'm completely at the mercy of the hill, of whatever it is that I'm at the mercy of, gravity and trees and whatever. And so what I have to do is try to figure out how to be in that. That's the extreme thing. I was actually going somewhere with that, and it's gone now.
Well, actually, as we were talking about that, it just reminded me of that rhythm of children, of babies and children. And it's just, and I've heard that, I mean, my parents told me that when if you get your child into a routine, life is going to be a whole lot better for you and your wife. But I don't know how many times we didn't fight it intentionally, but as you said, we needed to surrender to his schedule and how God had made him to,
I think so.
That. And it was a tough thing because it doesn't necessarily mesh with what you want to do as an adult. But it's a whole lot, life is a lot better if you can keep your child onto this routine that works for them.
Yeah.
And you ultimately, it'll work for both of you. And life is a whole lot simpler when you're submitting to that.
Yeah, I think you just made me think of that other Galley essay, the Youth Agency and Industry. I'm going to post it for you. I'll put it on my web space and post a link. And you don't have to look at it, but he deals with this kind of stuff. I mean, you could say agency and industry both kind of are what we're talking about. It's our agency to turn on the lights when it gets dark, to turn on the air conditioner when it gets hot, to make our child, say it was like we can control and conquer everything, and we are given to control and conquer some things. We are, but it might be much easier to control and conquer than it is to surrender and learn how to operate in the. And there are some things we can't. For example, death. We can't, and that's why we're terrified of it. And Galley will make us think of that. It's like why are we so infatuated with the youth? Because we're so terrified of death. It's like those kinds of. Yes, sir.
Excuse me, sir.
Yes, sir.
Just discovered that even though they said that they would bill us directly for your lodging, that it was put on your credit card.
It was.
Can I get a copy of that? And I'd like to see if I can get you a reimbursement check before you leave today.
Okay.
If not,